Hey, it's really nice to be here. This is very exciting. There are hundreds of people maybe watching this live, which is really scary and gratifying and exhilarating all at the same time. My name's Jason Mankey. This talk is really from this book. Of course it's from this book because, promotion and all that. This book is called The Witch's Wheel of the Year, Rituals for Circles, Solitaries, and Covens. And it does have a lot of rituals in it, but it's also about, in particular, the Wheel of the Year and how that came to be and what holidays we celebrate during the Wheel of the Year and how we celebrate them, etc., etc. This is usually a 90-minute talk that I'm going to try to do parts of in about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. Maybe I'll get done in 10 minutes. Who knows? Probably not. I'm not drinking that much Red Bull. So it'll be a little different from what I normally do. So it should be fun. And I want to talk about the Wheel of the Year because one of the things about the Wheel of the Year is that it's not as cut and dried as people tend to think it is. So I have a slideshow so you don't look at my face the entire way. That's just, I think it's better this way. So when we look at the Wheel of the Year, we think that this has been celebrated in this particular way for thousands of years. It all is so neat and so perfect. And, it just feels that way. It feels timeless. Feels like people have always been doing it in this particular way. But that's not really the case. The modern Witch's Wheel of the Year is something that has evolved over the last 50 or 60 years. And a lot of people don't know that story. And that's most of the story that I'm going to tell you during our limited time together. So we have a couple of different people to thank when it comes to the Wheel of the Year. The first are the Celts of Ireland. A lot of times people look at the Wheel of the Year and they say, this is a Celtic Wheel of the Year. And to some extent, that's true. Some of the Sabbats are Celtic in nature, but they're a specific type of Celtic in nature. They come from Ireland. They're Irish Celtic. Samhain, Imbolc, Lunasa, and Beltane all come to us from the Celts of Ireland. So they're Celtic Irish holidays. There are equivalents to the four Sabbats that I just mentioned in Wales, but they have different names, and they were probably celebrated in a little bit different ways in Wales versus Ireland. There were Celts all over Europe at one period of time. They didn't just live in the British Isles and in France. They lived in various other places of Europe, but we don't know what holidays those other Celts celebrated, and we don't have any evidence of what they celebrated, so we don't know. So the Sabbats are Irish Celtic, and that's our first group that we need to thank for having the Sabbats. The second is the tilt of the earth, and this isn't a surprise. We get equinoxes and solstices because the earth is tilted, and out of that year, we get four kind of really big celestial events. We get 2 days of equal light and dark. Those are the equinoxes. And then we get the shortest day of the year, the winter solstice. And then we get the longest day of the year, the summer solstice. And people have been celebrating the summer and winter solstices for thousands of years. They are among humanity's oldest holidays. We know that 7,000 years ago, people started building shrines to the winter solstice in particular, that they would align with the winter solstice on that day. And they didn't just do this in Europe and Asia. They also did this in North and South America, and they did this in Africa. It was a very important thing, commemorating the solstices. And then the third source we get the Wheel of the Year from and the Sabbats is this man, the grand old man of witchcraft, someone sometimes called the father or the dad of Wicca. This is a guy named Gerald Gardner. And Gerald Gardner is important because he was the first modern public witch. He was the first person to ever say, I identify as a witch in a religious and spiritual sense, which was a pretty groundbreaking and revolutionary when he did that in 1951. He was also the first person to write about witchcraft as a living tradition. And he wrote 2 books, neither of which I really recommend that you read because I don't think they're particularly good. But he wrote 2 books, Witchcraft Today in 1954 and The Meaning of Witchcraft, which was published in 1959. They're important from a historical perspective. And in those books, he talks about some holidays that he calls the Greater Sabbats. And he lists the Greater Sabbats as pretty much the Irish Celtic holidays that today we call Lunasa, Samhain, Imbolc, and Beltane. However, that's not what he called them in 1954 in Witchcraft Today. Instead, he called them by the less poetic names of February Eve, May Eve, August Eve, and November Eve. Today, when we celebrate those Sabbats, we generally celebrate them on February 1st, May 1st, August 1st, and then October 31st. So Gardner's even days are a little bit off, but in some ways, he's more accurate than maybe we are today because the Celts of Ireland, they celebrated the start of a day at sunset. So instead of marking a new day at sunrise or midnight, the new day was marked at sunset. So then February Eve Imbolc would have ran from the night of January 31st until the following evening on February 1st. So those are ways to celebrate the Sabbats. You can do them the day, kind of the night before the day. In 1959, he decides that he's going to change the names of the Greater Sabbats from all being Eves. And he calls Imbolc Candlemas. He still calls May Eve. And while it doesn't sound poetic, especially in the United States, May Day is a very major holiday in the UK and in other parts of Europe. So having a May Eve makes a lot more sense there than it does in the US and Canada. He calls Lunasa Lammas, and he calls Samhain Halloween. He doesn't use the Irish Celtic names. However, beginning in the 1970s, people would begin to readopt the Celtic names of the holidays. The first book that I have found that calls the Sabbats by their Irish Celtic names is The Tree by Raymond Buckland, which was published in 1974. And he uses Samhain, Lunasa, Beltane, and Imbolc in his book. And pretty much after that, most people began to also adopt those names. So when I do the long version of this workshop, I talk specifically about each of the Sabbats for a brief period of time, but we don't have that much. However, I think it's important to talk about kind of the origins of the names amongst the Irish Celts of the 4 Greater Sabbats. And we'll come back in a minute to why these are called the Greater Sabbats in the first books of witchcraft. So Samhain is usually thought to poetically mean summer's end, but it was really different amongst the Irish Celts than it is among modern day witches and pagans. In Irish Celtic mythology, it was a night for magic, especially love magic. Oftentimes monsters would show up, especially in the Welsh material. There were enchanted gifts, there were bonfires in the stories. In mundane practice, it feels as if it was a time when different tribes would get together, they would pass new laws, and since you had a great deal of people coming together, it would have been a really great time for feasting because that's what people do when they all get together. And maybe because it was late in the season, they also celebrated the harvest on October 31st. We're not really sure. One thing we do know about the earliest Samhain celebrations is they really weren't focused on the dead. They were much more focused on the fae, on the fairy folk. And they were focused on the fae because they were terrified of the fae coming and harming them, hurting their grain stores, hurting their cattle, and hurting other things. So they were really, really nervous about that. And that's how the Irish Celts celebrated Samhain. We think Imbolc, the name, has something to do with lactating lambs because that's what happens in early February. Lambs give birth and they produce milk. Also, we know from history that that day was sacred to Bridget, who was a real pagan deity celebrated in Ireland and probably the rest of the British Isles. Later, that pagan figure became a Catholic saint, and she's also a Loa amongst voodoo and other traditions that are similar to voodoo. Candlemas is still used as a name by some people for Imbolc on February 1st or February 2nd. It's an old Greek Christian holiday. It comes from the Roman word Februa, which means purification. And then they had a holiday named after that, which was a Roman holiday of purification. The two holidays have nothing in common other than a date. So there's something about the dates that we associate with the Sabbats that resonates across cultures, even though they may not celebrate those things in the same way. Beltane was an ancient fire festival. The earliest reference to Beltane that we have comes from the year 900 of the Common Era in a thing called Cormac's Glossary. And he talks about Beltane, May Day. And he says, two fires which Druids used to make with great incantations, and they used to bring the cattle as a safeguard against the diseases of each year to those fires and drive the cattle between them. Because people have done a lot of folklore studies in Ireland and in Scotland, they know that people were still doing things exactly like this on the 1st or 2nd of May up into the about 1900. So these traditions have stayed around for a very long time. And today we think of Beltane mostly with maypoles and early spring. Again, for the Irish Celts, it was a fire celebration, and they were really worried about making sure that their cattle survived the coming summer. Because if something were to happen to your crops or your cattle, winter's going to be really bad. So that was really what Beltane was about. Beltane, the word bell is thought to mean maybe shining or bright, which is certainly something that happens in early May, unless maybe you live in Minnesota, Michigan, or Canada. Lunasa is named after Llew, who was an Irish Celtic deity. He was the god of many skills. He was bright and shining as well. His name might also mean skillful hand. On the continent, there's a Celtic deity named Lugas, who's a deity of ravens, dark places, oaths, and vows. Some people think that the two deities might be related. So if that's true, then Llew would be related to ravens, oaths, and dark places as well. But he gives his name to Lunasa. Lammas is an Anglo-Saxon name for the holiday, and the Anglo-Saxons probably appropriated Lammas from Lunasa and the Irish Celts, and then changed the name a little bit. And Christianity became known as the Loaf Mass because it was the first grain harvest in the British Isles, especially in Ireland and in Scotland. So something worth celebrating. It was sometimes called the Gule of August, which people thought originally meant the Yule of August. And it would be great to get extra presents, but it really probably doesn't mean Yule of August. What it probably means is the Feast of August, with Gule being a Welsh word meaning feast. So the early witches called the equinoxes and solstices the lesser Sabbats. And they called them the lesser Sabbats because they were originally celebrated on the full moon nearest the Sabbat, which is really different from how we celebrate them today. Most of us on Saturday will be celebrating the summer solstice on the summer solstice instead of waiting for a full moon. But for the first 10 years or so, public witchcraft, they were celebrated on the full moons. That changed in 1958 when a young lady wrote to Gerald Gardner and said, "My coven really thinks it would be great to celebrate the lesser Sabbats on the day that they actually occur instead of waiting for the full moon." And Gerald said, "What a great idea. I think you should do that too." And from then on, we've kind of celebrated all 8 Sabbats the same way. However, the names of the Sabbats, the lesser Sabbats in particular, evolved over time. And while Yule is a genuinely old name, the names Ostara, Mabon, and Litha really are not. And those names have only been associated with the summer solstice and the equinoxes since 1974, when an American named Aidan Kelly was putting together a calendar for his witchcraft group. He decided he wanted to rename the unexciting summer solstice, autumn equinox, and spring equinox, because that's what most witches called them back then. They didn't have poetic sounding names. And he thought that didn't make a lot of sense. So he decided to come up with poetic names. And he came up with Litha, Ostara, and Mabon. And two of those are really good names, and they make some sense. The one of them, Mabon, doesn't really make any sense. And as we will see, is not a particularly great name. But Kelly's names caught on very, very, very quickly. By 1975, they were reprinted in the Green Egg magazine. And then in 1979, these names appear in Starhawk's The Spiral Dance, one of the most influential witch books ever published. And from then on, they have been basically inescapable. They're on everything, and they're even in books that the author doesn't like the name of one of the Sabbats, which has happened to me. So they're everywhere. And as I said, some of them are good names, some of them less so. Kelly got the name Ostara basically from an English historian named Bede, who was writing about the Anglo-Saxon months of the year. And he wrote that there was a goddess named Eoster, and that her month was basically April. But eventually, people began using the name of the month to refer to a particular Christian holiday, which celebrated the resurrection of Jesus, and they began calling that holiday Easter. So eventually, the goddess got forgotten, the month got forgotten, and all of a sudden, they're just calling this Christian day Easter, when it's originally kind of the name of a goddess. And Bede wrote about this in 725 of the Common Era in his book, The Reckoning of Time. Today, when we think of Ostara, the goddess, we mostly owe that to Jacob Grimm, he of Grimm's Fairy Tales, who was looking for the origins of the name of Easter, found the goddess, and then assumed that anything that had to do with Easter that wasn't connected to Christianity was probably connected to this goddess in some ways. Eos also means dawn, which is another possible origin for the goddess's name, and therefore today what we call Ostara. Bede also wrote about the summer solstice, kind of. He wrote that there was a month called Litha, and he said that that was a double month in June and July, and it usually means navigable or gentle, and he was referencing seas. Aidan Kelly saw this and thought, Litha, what a great name for the summer solstice. Certainly better than summer solstice, though I will admit I personally am very partial to midsummer. And then there was the last name he made up, Mabon. And Mabon has nothing to do with Bede. It would have made more sense, I think. It's the symmetry of using Bede would have been a little bit better. But he decided that long ago there was a myth, and that myth was very similar to Persephone being taken into the underworld. And in this myth, Mabon is one of the gods that is taken to the underworld, and that every culture had this version of a young man being abducted and taken into the underworld. And in the Mabinogion, where Mabon, the god, shows up, he is kind of saved from an early demise. And Kelly thinks, wow, this kind of supports my idea, so I'm going to name the autumn equinox Mabon. There's nothing that really relates the figure of Mabon to the autumn equinox. The name Mabon actually means son of the mother. So it's really sort of a strange choice. However, it did catch on very quickly. And even people who don't like the name have to admit that when you say Mabon, it conveys an awful lot of information. There is another name that they could have called the autumn equinox, and that name is Harvest Home, which is a very real holiday in the UK, especially in rural areas. And the dates of harvest home could change quite quickly. It really had to do with when the last crops in a given community were brought in. So when you brought in the last of your grain crop, that was harvest home. So it could be in late August, could be in September, could be as early as October. There are some witches who still call the autumn equinox harvest home. So when you're celebrating Mabon today, in a lot of ways, you're celebrating harvest home, which is a very, very old holiday. We know that the Norse celebrated Yule. Exactly how they celebrated Yule is an open question. Some people think that Yule was probably a season and not the name of a particular day. But perhaps during that season, from middle of November through the middle of January, the most important day might have been the winter solstice. Eventually, Yule was also used as a synonym for Christmas. But when the first witches were celebrating the winter solstice, Yule was a really obvious choice for the name of the Sabbath. When I do this workshop, I usually talk about when the first of the year starts. When is Happy New Year? Because this is a question that has always kind of intrigued me. Most of us today think of it as starting with Samhain. And the idea that Samhain is the start of the new year comes from one book called Celtic Folklore, Welsh and Manx from 1901, where the book's author wrote of the ancient Celts on Samhain. This is the day when the tenure of land terminates and when servant men go to their places. In other words, it's the beginning of a new year. The truth of the matter is, though, is that we don't really know when the Celts celebrated the new year. So in that sense, Samhain is as good of a guess as any other time. So it could be Samhain, could be the winter solstice, return of the light and all that, which is a great time to have a celebration of the new year. January 1st was started by a pagan, Julius Caesar, in his calendar. It also celebrates Janus, the god of January, who is in charge of beginnings, endings, and doorways. Celebrating the start of the year on January 1st is also fun because everybody else is partying and drinking too. And most of the pagans I know are about having a good time. Imbolc is another holiday that sometimes people use for the first of the year. It's my favorite personally because the light is so much more and brighter at Imbolc than it is at the winter solstice. And then Ostara is a great time to celebrate the new year because it's the Persian New Year, and people have been celebrating the spring equinox as the start of a new year for thousands of years. The Persian New Year is based on astrology, and the astrological new year begins on the spring equinox. What's probably most important about the Sabbats is what you really want to do is you want to have the Sabbats revolve around what you do more so than anything else. That's what's really, really important. And a lot of people say, well, Lammas is an autumn harvest celebration. Well, maybe it is in your case. If it's not, celebrate what is going on around you. If Imbolc is the start of spring where you live, great, celebrate the start of spring. But if it's the height of winter, and I lived in Michigan for a long time, where it is the height of winter, celebrate the height of winter. Books often tell us how we're supposed to celebrate, but really we should be celebrating what's outside of our windows. So that is that very short version of that presentation. We can open the chat back up. So that's really cool. We'll take questions for a while. I love questions. If I don't get any questions, I'll just talk about the book and how great it is, or not great. I don't know. Most of the reviews are really good. I love the Sabbats. I think we're so blessed with all 8 of them. They each have something to offer. They each have something to share. And, one of the things I also love about them is they fit into our greater calendar in the United States, especially pretty easily. We get all of that Halloween stuff at Samhain. We get all this stuff if you grew up in a Christian household and celebrating Christmas. You get all of that in Yule. So you get all of that with all of our Sabbats. And all of this information and a lot more information is in this book. Midsummer has always been a difficult Sabbath for me, Bats. This is a question, what are some of my favorite midsummer traditions? And For me, I like to honor the Fae outside my yard. We have a lemon tree where we're pretty sure that that's where the Fae live in our area. So we always give them gifts and presents, and we do that at midsummer. And we also celebrate the solar wheel, which is a very old tradition that goes back thousands of years. And as late as 1900, people used to celebrate the summer solstice by taking a burning wheel and letting it roll down a hill. My wife won't let me do that, but we will sometimes toss rings into the fire for various things. My favorite Sabbath is Mickey Mueller's question, what is my favorite Sabbath? Is Yule. It's not even close. I love Yule so much because it has so much to do and so many different ways to celebrate it. I loved Yule so much that I wrote a book called Llewellyn's Little Book of Yule, which will be out in September. Amber Jones asks, does your book have recipes for food for each Sabbath? And there are some in the book, but not for everyone. Gwion Raven wrote a book called The Magic of Food, which kind of has a lot of those things in it. So that's one worth checking out. Chris Hughes, not that Chris Hughes, asks, what are your thoughts about the difficulty of celebrating during lockdown? It is very difficult to celebrate during lockdown. I'm a witch who loves to practice with their coven. I have 2 covens, and I love being with a group to celebrate the solstices and the equinoxes and everything else. And obviously we can't do that. So it's been a challenge. I am lucky that I married another witch. So my wife and I have been doing a lot of celebrations together, kind of smaller things. Elliot Director talks about the gendering of the holidays. I think that the idea of the gendering of the holidays, the goddess and god, all through the year was something that we really heard a lot about in the 70s and 80s and up and through the 90s as a part of the Wheel of the Year. That's certainly not how the Irish Celts constructed the Wheel of the Year. It's not how I practice the Wheel of the Year. I think there are lots of different ways to do it. And when we do things with groups especially, everything should be as inclusive as possible. No one doesn't like to see themselves in the circle in a way. Like if you do ritual and you can't see yourself and what's going on, that's not going to resonate with you. So our rituals should always be inclusive. And I think a lot of witches are getting away from that whole thing. Let's so many questions. Let's see. You are so not a book made witch. Thank you. Oh, that's really nice, Sharon. Yeah. So I think that's a lot of it. Let's see. I've got Gwen says there's so much to observe about the light and also nature that it makes sense to celebrate what is going on around us. And I really, really do. I think that's really the most important thing. I know moving from Michigan to California, a lot of my Sabbath celebrations just didn't work here. And I would pull up an old autumn equinox ritual and have my new coven do it. And it was terrible because it was about how cold it was and how, crisp autumn nights. And September is like the hottest month here. So that really didn't make any sense at all. So you really should build your Sabbath rituals around where you live. And that's really kind of difficult with the spring and fall Sabbaths, especially. Like what is an Ostara ritual to you might be an Imbolc ritual to me in California because, things blossom earlier here than they do in other parts of the country. So it can be really, really different. And we should take that into account. If you're giggling over how you're personifying the Wheel of the Year, you should probably change the Wheel of the Year to represent where you're at. Chris says that they celebrate their holidays outside except for Yule, and there was Beltane snow in Pennsylvania, and I remember that well from Michigan. I celebrate most of my Sabbaths indoors, which breaks my heart sometimes. But I live in California where there's not a lot of yard and there's not a lot of easily accessible public places to do ritual. So we have a ritual room and we do most of our rituals in there, even at Lammas and even at Midsummer sometimes. And it's really strange to do a Lammas ritual and have the air conditioner run. It doesn't sound very natural to me, but you sometimes do what you have to do. Though I wish I could be outside more often for a lot of them. Thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. I hope this was fun. I hope I made sense as I tried to really quickly prattle through a lot of this information. You can find me online. I'm Jason. Really appreciate it. And thanks to Llewellyn for doing this. This is really cool. Hopefully we'll be doing it more in the future because it's really nice to connect with people everywhere on Facebook and stuff. So thank you all. Blessed be. Have a great midsummer.